Professor Worthen, you are the theater specialist, and I wonder if you could answer the question: is there such a thing as a post-dramatic Shakespeare?
It's a really good question. And like most good questions, it has a kind of complicated answer. On the one hand, yes, of course there's post-dramatic Shakespeare, because when we look around at the world of Shakespeare performance today, there's such a variety of Shakespeare production, and some of it would fall into the general category that people would call post-dramatic as a kind of label. On the other hand, the term post-dramatic theater, I think, is a complicated one, and in some respects is a little bit contradictory to the notion that there can be a post-dramatic theater that is connected to a specific author. When Hans Lehmann developed the idea of post-dramatic theater in his book, he set up the post-dramatic theater meaning a kind of event in which all of the different discourses of performance, the writing of the script, the acting, lighting design, scenic design, the disposition of the mise en scène as a whole, and the acting of the audience were all on an equal kind of a plane, rather than the notion in a kind of what he calls the old-fashioned dramatic theater, in which the understanding of the theater was that the script, the text, the world devised by the author should be delivered through the theater to the audience, so that the theater had a kind of subordinate function communicating the author's ideas to the spectators. Now, of course, for me, that notion that traditional dramatic theater ever did that thing is, I think, not entirely true. But one understands why it is that Lehmann wanted to set up a very conventional notion of what dramatic theater is about in order to excavate this idea of how a new theater would work. A theater in which the script, as he says at one point, that the writing is incorporated into the performance as a foreign body rather than as the determining ground plan or paradigm that the performance should execute. So I think there is post-dramatic Shakespeare, but in one sense the notion that there can be a post-dramatic theater connected to an author whose works are appreciated as written documents and as literature is, I think, internally problematic. But to think of it as an example of a kind of performance that one would describe as post-dramatic, the first thing that comes to mind is the whole genre of immersive performance. And of course, immersive performance, in which the spectators occupy the same playing space with the performers, in which the action takes place all around them, in which there's a heavily designed environment rather than a scene in front of an absent audience. That is, it's not definitive, it's not the only kind of post-dramatic theater there is, but it's clearly a kind of theater designed to produce an event within which the text would have one line of functioning, but only one. And the performance that I'm the most familiar with of this kind that does work like that would be Punch Drunk Theater's Sleep No More, which has been running in New York now for quite a while and was previously produced outside Boston and in London. And it's an interesting example because in one regard, it's all about the space. They have 100,000 square feet of warehouse space that has been turned into this meticulously designed 6-story environment. And you, the spectator, are invited in, you put on a mask, and then you are turned loose in this environment. And the connection to Shakespeare is important, but also peripheral. It's a performance. Sleep No More obviously comes from Macbeth, and there is a Macbeth narrative in this performance, but not a single word of Macbeth is ever spoken. There aren't speaking actors in the performance, there are dancers. So as you, the spectator, are wandering around this very brilliant and interesting environment, every now and then a group of actors will come by you and you can follow them or not, and they are often, but not always, performing in a highly choreographed way some scene that resembles a scene from Macbeth. So to think about the action of this whole event, in which sometimes you're dealing with dancers who are doing something related to Macbeth, sometimes you are in an environment that is very resonant with the imagery of Macbeth. So there's a forest, like Birnam Wood Shall Come to Dunsinane. It's very dark and gloomy and suggestive in that way. There's lots of scenes involving blood and violence, in addition to the scenes that act out scenes from Macbeth. So there's that line, but there's also a detective narrative taking place. Much of the score, there's a very heavy audio score that is pronounced throughout the whole space, much of which is drawn from Hitchcock films. So actually, if we're to think about this as a post-dramatic event, it's one, not an event that separates the representer from the represented and an audience that is receiving that thing. We are all in the same place. It does involve Macbeth, but Macbeth is in a way a kind of foreign body here, since the text of Macbeth is represented mostly by events from the plot of Macbeth. And then that particular part of the event is in some ways almost overwhelmed by the movement vocabulary, the sonic vocabulary, the visual vocabulary, and by the fact that any given spectator doesn't see it in order, as though there were an order. So as you're wandering through this space and things are happening all around you, sometimes you will see from the first scene you might see that is from Macbeth could be the last scene, in the play. So to that extent, and they run the scenes 3 times, so that there's a sense in which you might well see scenes out of order. So to that extent, although I think it's possible to say there is a post-dramatic Shakespeare, and this would be a perfectly fine example of it, in the sense that it's not communicating the script of Macbeth to us as a whole, but putting us in an environment, in a kind of event that is really only about the event of performance itself. At the same time, it would also be possible to have a kind of feeling of the contradictoriness of that sentence or that phrase, insofar as, at least for some people, the one thing that this post-dramatic Shakespeare doesn't give you is Shakespeare.